So in the past, I've learned tatting from an antique book manual. A few days ago, I learned how to spin from the help of a bunch of wonderful YouTube tutorials from Evie's channel, Jillian Eve. I think learning from books is great, but after I bought a few books on learning how to weave and getting absolutely overwhelmed with all the terminology, I put it aside for a while until I realized that my local creative arts center was hosting a weaving class, and I wove this lovely shawl that I'm wearing right now. So you might have guessed it, today we are going to be doing the final step of our flax to linen process. For day 4 of Craftmas, we are going to be weaving our linen yarn into fabric. Now don't worry if you are completely new to weaving. I'm not going to get into too many technical details here today because I don't want to scare anyone away, and I just want to give you an overview of what I did, and maybe it will also give you the weaving bug and the courage to try some of this yourself. Step 1 of the whole process is to dig out my loom. I'm not going to show you the footage from that because it was painful to watch. Suffice it to say that I haven't used this loom since I got it, and it's made it through multiple moves with me. It was stored in the back of my crafts closet, and it was such a hassle to get out that my fitness tracker tracked it as high intensity exercise. We got it out and I set it up. I unfolded it, so it is what is called a table loom. In the crafts workshop, unfortunately, it was the instructor's last ever workshop she was giving. She was moving away and retiring and downsizing, so she did not have room for all of the looms that she owned. Oh my gosh, you should have seen her loom collection. She had some absolute beautiful floor looms and countermarch looms, but I was still incredibly lucky and I got this 8-shaft table loom. Shafts are the things that move up and down when you're weaving to spread the fibers apart and open what's called the shed through which you weave. And the more of them you have, the more complicated patterns you could get. I personally, if I were to buy a loom new, I was kind of looking at just a 4-shaft loom, but this is what my teacher had, so that's what I bought. After the loom was set up, the next step that you have to do is put the warp onto your loom. Ever since I started weaving, I can't mix up the warp and the weft because the warp is the part that I don't like doing and the weft is the part that's really fun, where you're putting the shuttle left and right and you're using the beater to beat everything in place. That's the fun part. But Evie from Jillian Eve has a really fun mnemonic device, and that is that you go warp speed ahead, so that's your warp, and you weave from right to weft. So when you're setting up the warp, you're basically setting up half of your fabric already. Now, a few things to keep in mind before this. I had spun like the absolute wind since I put out my spinning video to turn as much of the flax, the commercial flax that I had, into usable warp. I ended up with 119 grams of it, but I'm a new spinner, so I'm not very quick. So I got a lot done for me, but there's a decision that you have to make in how you are going to weave something, right? Like, do I want something that's the full 32 inches width of my loom, but then I only have enough yarn left to make like 1 inch of the weaving because I used all the yarn to go all the way left and to make the warp that wide. If I make the warp like 2 inches wide, that's fine too, but then I'm weaving forever and ever, like I'm making a long strip. So I tried to do some calculations to make a piece that would end up being roughly square. 10 inches square is what I ended up calculating. Because I had limited amount of warp yarn available, and I do own what's called a warping board, and a warping board helps you measure out the exact same lengths of yarn for putting on your loom. So a lot of times when you're doing weaving, I think this weaving was something like nearly 400 lengths of yarn. So I had to count out 400 lengths of yarn on this. It can be difficult to do if you don't have something helping you to measure it out in the exact same length every time. So you have this big warping board that you can use for that. But again, the one that I got from my instructor is big, and it's like a 10-yard warp, something like that. So I was doing a 1-yard warp and that wasn't going to work on the warping board, so I had to do what's called direct warping on my table loom. A bit unusual. I think people tend to do that more with a rigid head loom than table looms, and it was complicated. I did a lot of walking that day. I think I had more steps that day between the front and back of my loom than I had in all the days, weeks prior. I got it warped, I got it done, and then at that moment, basically, it's fastened to the front of my loom. So I'm trying to make the warp so that it goes from the front of my loom through to the back. And you have to do a little careful manipulation, because at the front, where your beater is, the beater that's kind of pushing your warp threads in place when you're weaving, there's something called a reed. And a reed has a hole or an opening in it for your yarns to pass through, so that when you're weaving, you're not getting knots and tangles. So you have to thread the warp through each one of those. So I'm threading them through, making sure it's attached to the front of my loom, and now I have to take it off with that little pole that I was using and attach it to the back of my loom. So I had to cut through the yarns at the back around the pole. That was hard. That was the first time I cut my homespun yarn, and I thought I was gonna cry. Yeah, I don't know. It's very emotional. Like, you really want to make sure you didn't mess up, but at some point you just gotta do something and figure it out if you mess something up along the way. But before you can tie all of that yarn to the back of your loom, you have to feed it through what are called heddles. And heddles, on mine, they're pieces of fabric with a hole in the center. On other looms that I've used, it's metal with an eyelet hole in the center. And you thread your yarn in one by one. Why? Okay, so this is where we go to the pattern portion. I knew I wanted some sort of twill-like pattern. I have this lovely pattern book, and I was choosing between two patterns that have the same threading. So I knew I could do the threading and then choose the pattern a little bit later based on the treadling that I was doing. Well, you don't treadle on a table loom, but it's fine. But basically, when you weave, right, you have sets of yarns that then need to be opened up first in this direction and you weave, and then in that direction you weave, and then in this direction you put a shot of weft through, and then in that direction. And how that's controlled is by the heddles that the yarn runs through. And so when the heddles lift up, those particular ones go up, and when the heddles go down, those particular ones go down. So that's how you're controlling how different yarns are going up and down. So the more shafts you have, the more combinations of different yarns lifting and lowering you can have. So I used a 4-shaft pattern, and I spent the long and slightly headache-inducing, I'm gonna be honest, threading my yarn through the heddles in the pattern that I wanted, in the threading that I wanted, in order to get one of the two patterns that I was interested in. After everything was threaded on, I then needed to attach those ends to the back of my loom. And you tie them in groups. There's special weaving knots that you use to make sure that first you secure them in place and you can get even tension. Even tension is very important to get across your piece. So that takes a while of testing and feeling, retying the knots, and then tying another knot to secure them in place, because your warp is going to be under tension. You don't want things to slip, knots to come undone, anything like that. So that was interesting. It was like an important part of my weaving class, was learning how to tie appropriate knots. So it was tied like surgeon's knots. And then there's a weaver's knots if your warp breaks. So I don't know, I didn't realize that learning how to tie a proper knot was an important part of weaving. After all of that, the warping of my loom was done. Basically, half of the piece is now in place. And number one, I'm exhausted. It's late in the evening, so I left the weaving for the morning. But I knew that I could wake up bright and early, fresh and ready to start the part that I find the best, which is the weaving. We spent all of yesterday setting up the loom. The warping part of the loom is always a bit headache-inducing for me, if I'm being honest. The biggest thing is I am not leaving my loom under tension anytime I'm walking away from it. Linen just really likes to snap, especially in dry conditions. I don't remember where I heard this story, where someone was weaving linen and it was cold out. It was the winter time. She was like in a cabin, so she was doing it near her fireplace to keep her fingers warm, and her warps kept on snapping, and it turns out that the air was being dried out too much from the fireplace, but once she put a humidifier underneath her warp, the whole problem was solved. And of course she moved her loom a little further away from the fireplace as well. I have my humidifier here. I'm going to put it on the chair that I'm sitting on so that I can get to the warp. I also, as I was getting my breakfast ready and everything this morning, I put wet towels on the portions of my warp that are going to get the most rough treatment today, because as a lot of you pointed out last time, linen is stronger when it's wet. So having moisture and humidity is really good for it. I've also wetted my weft so that, you know, my weft is going to be doing a lot of bends and turns, so I want it I want it to go under the least stress as possible. So I'm gonna first wind up this bobbin and set up my shuttle, and then I think it's time to start weaving. I'm not exactly sure what you could call this textile. In terms of feel, how does it feel against my skin? Rough, very rough. So I think I'm gonna keep it like this. I'm gonna keep it as a tapestry. I kind of feel like the knitting needle fits perfectly with the whole theme of the tapestry, and I'm gonna find a really nice place to hang it up, somewhere that I can look at and see this piece. I am just in awe. I don't know, this is the first textile finished object that I have made fully from seed through processing, hand spinning, home dyeing with natural plants that I grew, and then weaving it on my loom. And I couldn't be happier. Thank you so much for watching Craftmas. If you're wondering, well, it kind of seems like you came to a lovely wrap-up point with this project. What are we going to be doing for the rest of Craftmas? I have left you all a bit of a hint in every single video. I think it's a pretty obvious one. Some people have asked me about it already on what we will be doing for the rest of Craftmas, but it is knitting related. I'm very excited. So if you're interested in that, feel free to subscribe, and I will see you the day after tomorrow for the start of a really fun knitting project. I'll see you then. Bye.